Charles Dickens said, the French Revolution, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. We are going to look at chapter 18 as a whole, though. Good or bad? Section 1, the French Revolution begins. Poverty and deep social divisions were at the root of the French Revolution. The Third Estate, the vast majority of the French people, was heavily taxed and discontented. On the eve of the revolution, financial crisis gripped the government of Louis XVI. Rather than accept higher taxes, and the commoners in France's legislative body, the Estates General, broke off to form a national assembly. Anticipating an attack by the king's forces, commoners stormed the Bastille prison, marking the start of the revolution. The new assembly took control of the Catholic Church and adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The document was inspired by the English Bill of Rights and the American Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. The assembly then wrote a new constitution establishing a limited monarchy and a legislative assembly. France was soon at war with Austria, where some feared the revolution might spread. Louis XVI was taken captive by the Paris Commune. The Commune forced the Legislative Assembly to suspend the monarchy and to call for a national convention. The revolution entered a more violent phase. Now, what I'd like you to do is pay close attention to this grid of the three estates. The first estate is made up of the clergy. It consisted of the rich and poor clergy. There were very wealthy abbots, members of the aristocracy who lived in luxury off of the wealthy church lands. There were poor parish priests who lived much like the peasants. And then the second estate, the nobility is who you find in this estate. They inherited their titles and got their wealth from the land. Some members of the nobility had little money, but all had privileges of noble rank. However, most enjoyed both privilege and wealth. And then the largest estate by population is the third estate, the common people. It was by far the largest group in France. Everyone who was not a member of the first and second estates was a member of the third. It included wealthy merchants whose wealth rivaled that of nobility, doctors and lawyers, shopkeepers, and the urban poor, the peasants who worked the land. Of course, we have to look at the leaders of the country of France at the time, and here they are. The king, Louis XVI, was an awkward, clumsy man who had a good heart but was unable to relate to the people on a personal level. He often appeared unfeeling and gruff. He was insecure and seems to have disliked being king of France. When one of his ministers resigned, he was heard to remark, "Why can't I resign too?" Marie Antoinette, in her early years as queen, was flighty and irresponsible. She was from Austria-Hungary, and the marriage was used as an alliance between the countries. She spent huge amounts of money on clothes, buying a new dress nearly every other day. Being Austrian, she was terribly unpopular in France and had few friends. Now, this is where they lived. It's called Versailles. You can obviously go there on a tour even today, and you can see the level of opulence in which it was decorated by looking at these pictures. They lived in luxury and splendor at the magnificent Palace of Versailles outside of France. Now, look at this graph. It is, of course, found in your review. You can see how the largest level of population, land ownership, and taxation belonged to the third estate. So they were extremely highly taxed, and they were about to be taxed more when the revolution broke out to pay for things that were happening in the Americas. We'll see that on the next slide. So the red represents the third estate, the green the second estate, and the blue the first estate, which of course is made up by the clergy. So the financial crisis that was at hand, the government of France, however, was bankrupt and was facing a serious financial crisis. Dare I call it a financial cliff. The crisis resulted from an inefficient and unfair tax structure which placed the burden of taxation on those least able to pay, the third estate, outdated medieval bureaucratic institutions, and a drained treasury which was the result of aiding the Americans during the American Revolution. We would not have won if it weren't for them. Long wars with England, and just blatant overspending. Due to the excessive spending of the French government, Louis XVI called a meeting. It was a meeting that would have representatives from all three estates, and this group was called the Estates General. So you can see this slide of the Estates General. On May 5th, 1789, when the Estates General met, each estate solemnly marched into the hall at Versailles. The third estate dressed all in black, the nobility dressed in all their finery, and the clergy dressed in full regalia. 300 people from the first estate, 300 from the second, and 600 from the third estate. The problem? Well, the third estate wanted each of their persons representing them to get one vote. But it says, should it be one vote per estate or one vote per person? The king turned the idea down of it being one vote per person. So anyway, this leads to the National Assembly. On June 17th, 1789, it was made up of three of the third estate members, and they were wanting to draft a constitution because they weren't feeling equally represented in the Estates General. They were locked out of their meeting place and moved to the new meeting place, which was a tennis court. Now, the next picture that we see is actually that of the first meeting that they were having with the Estates General at Versailles. Now, Mounier's suggestion, the tennis court oath. Once they were locked out, the delegates all agreed to move to a different location to continue with their meeting in the drafting of the Constitution. And where did they end up moving? They moved to a large area that would fit them, which ended up being a tennis court. So they ended up swearing the tennis court oath. The oath is known as the tennis court oath. It is said the National Assembly, considering that it has been summoned to establish the Constitution of the kingdom, decrees that all members of this assembly shall immediately take a solemn oath not to separate until the Constitution of the kingdom is established on firm foundation. Now, you can see a close-up of, or a far-away shot of this picture here with this particular slide. That's supposed to be them swearing the tennis court oath. Storming of the Bastille. Now, the storming of the Bastille is considered the true beginning of the American Revolution. On July 14th, 1789, the mob, joined by some of the king's soldiers, stormed the Bastille. It's a prison. The commander of the Bastille, Delaunay, attempted to surrender, but the mob would not accept it. He was killed, and they poured through the gates. No guard was left alive. Later in the day, the prisoners were released. There were only 7. 2 were convicted forgers. 1 was a loose-living aristocrat put in prison by his own father. Nevertheless, it was a great symbolic event, one which is still celebrated in France every year, like our 4th of July. Now, the time of great fear. By the end of July, the beginning of August, there were riots in the countryside. Peasants burned their nobles' chateaux and destroyed documents which contained their feudal obligations, kind of like their debt. It was called the Great Fear. The National Assembly responded to the Great Fear. On the night of August 4th, 1789, one by one, members of the nobility and clergy rose to give up feudal dues, serfdom, the tithe, hunting and fishing rights, and personal privileges. In one night, feudalism was destroyed in France. If you look at the pictures to the right, you will see the area of the peasant revolts in Dijon and then up by Cannes in the north, and the main currents of the Great Fear and the way that it moved. People were very, very upset, and having seen the changes in a place like our own country, they wanted the changes in their own country. So then out of all of this becomes the Declarations of the Rights of Man. The National Assembly adopted it on August 26, 1789. Trying to have a declaration like the Declaration of Independence in America, it proclaimed freedom for everyone. Women were not included. So down below you see it says, men are born free of equal in their rights. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The fundamental resource of all sovereignty resides in the nation. The law is the expression of the general will. All citizens have the right to take part personally or through representatives in the making of the law. So with these rights, liberty, property, and security of resistance of oppression, those are just kind of like the inalienable rights represented in the Declaration of Independence. It's rights you're supposed to be born with. So at this point, the conditions in Paris were poor. For the common people, the price of bread was high, supplies were in short, demand due to harvest failures. Rumors spread that the king and queen were responsible for these shortages, so the French troops marched to the capital. Rumors spread quickly among the already restless mobs that the king was intending to use them against the people. The dismissal of the finance minister Necker, who was popular with the Third Estate, ignited a spark. And then we have women, believe it or not, marching to Versailles. So they have to take a walk. It's pretty, a decent pace out from Paris, especially back then, to the Palace at Versailles. And October 5th, they did this. So if you remember, we were starting at May 5th with the Estates General, and here we are about 5 months later. A crowd of women demanding bread for their families marched toward Versailles. When they arrived, soaking wet from the rain, they demanded to see the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy. The king met with some of the women and agreed to distribute all the bread at Versailles to the crowd. Eventually, as far as having the king out at Versailles, they wanted the king to return to Paris, not out in the area of Versailles in utter opulence. So, under pressure from the National Guard, the king also agreed to return to Paris with his wife and children. It was the last time the king saw Versailles. Although the king reluctantly accepted the new constitution, he could not accept all the reforms, civil constitution of the clergy, for example, and decided to leave the country. On June 20th, 1791, this is actually a jump ahead by 2 years now, the king and his family set out for the border in a carriage. The king was disguised as a steward, and his son was actually wearing a dress. But at the border of the village of Versailles, he was recognized and eventually apprehended and then returned to Paris. So I want you to look at this slide because this one also in your review kind of shows you how these events took place just through 1789 itself. Bad conditions existed in France. The majority of the people are in the Third Estate. Then there's the Estates General, the National Assembly making the Tennis Court Oath and wrote a constitution, then the storming of the Bastille, the Declaration of the Rights of Men, and then the women marched off to Versailles. And that brings us to section 2. During the first years of the Revolution, a republic was established. Louis XVI was executed, and thousands of people were killed on suspicion of opposing the revolution. While factions within France fought for control, European states, fearing the spread of revolution, made plans to invade France. The National Convention responded by forming a Committee of Public Safety. The committee, led a 12-month reign of terror, executing close to 40,000 suspected enemies of expunging signs of Catholic influence. The committee also raised the largest army in European history and repelled the invading armies. With the crisis passed, the National Convention ended the Reign of Terror and executed its zealous leader, Maximilien Robespierre. Power shifted into the hands of the more moderate middle-class leaders who produced a constitution in 1795. The constitution called for a two-house legislative body and an executive committee called the Directory. The Directory faced mounting problems in 1799. A popular general, Napoleon Bonaparte, seized power in a coup d'état. So, a move to radicalism. Look at the picture to the right. It says, led by Georges Danton, the sans-culottes were beginning to be politically active in their own right and sought revenge in those who had helped the king. Thousands were massacred. So they were called sans-culottes, literally without trousers. That's the first picture, because the working men wore loose trousers instead of the tight-knee breeches of the nobility to the right. Eventually, the sans-culotte came to refer to any revolutionary or citizen. So here is Georges Jacques Danton, the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, and a revolutionary leader and powerful orator, which means he speaks really well, rose in the assembly and on September 2nd, 1792, boomed out these memorable words in his deepest bass voice. When the tocsin sounds, it will not be a signal of alarm, but a signal to charge against the enemies of our country. To defeat them, gentlemen, we need boldness, and again, boldness, and always boldness. And France will then be saved. Remember him. Two radical groups. So during the constitutional monarchy, there were two radical groups vying for power, the Girondins and the Mountain. Both were members of the Jacobins. Okay, although both groups were more radical in their views than the moderates who had designed the constitutional monarchy, the Girondins were somewhat less radical. In late 1791, the Girondins first emerged as an important power in France. The Mountains convinced the National Convention to pass a decree condemning the king to death. And so the picture to the left is that it is a drawing of the death of Louis XVI being guillotined. The Reign of Terror. So with the Reign of Terror, we have the Committee of Public Safety, which was 12 members, created and given many powers in response to the looming threat of war against France. It was first run by that man that looked a little angry, Danton, and then it was run by Maximilien Robespierre there to the right. Then the National Convention was called by the Legislative Assembly because of the Paris Commune, and that is where we get the Reign of Terror, where 40,000 people were killed, at least 16,000 at the guillotine, which is down there to the right. The Reign of Terror itself, after the death of Louis in 1793, the Reign of Terror began. Marie Antoinette led a parade of prominent and not so prominent citizens to their deaths. The guillotine, the new instrument of agrarian justice, was put to work. Public executions were considered educational, believe it or not. Women were encouraged to sit and knit during trials and executions. The Revolutionary Tribunal ordered the execution of 2,400 people in Paris by July 1794. Across France, again, 40,000 people lost their lives. Jean-Paul Marat. These are just some people that were important during that time. A Jacobin journalist who showed little regard for the truth was arrested for attacking the Girondins. The people of Paris turned even more toward the Jacobins. The people loved Marat, and he seemed to love them too. When he was acquitted of the charge, the crowd swarmed around him, scooped him up on their shoulders, and carried him out to the convention, cheering all the way. The last victim of the Reign of Terror, which I do find this ironic. So, we should know who the last victim was. Even the radical Jacobins, the supporters of Robespierre, came to feel that the terror must be stopped. Danton rose in the convention calling for an end to the terror. He was its next victim. When Robespierre called for the new purge in 1794, he seemed to threaten the other members of the Committee of Public Safety. The Jacobins had had enough. Cambon rose in the convention and said, "It is time to tell the whole truth. One man alone is paralyzing the will of the convention, and that man is Robespierre." Others quickly rallied to his support. Robespierre was arrested and sent to the guillotine. The next day, he was the last victim of the Reign of Terror. And we have the Directory. The people had grown tired of the instability and bloodshed of the revolution and were ready for something more moderate. By 1795, the Republic was gone, and 5 men with business interests had executive power in France. Royalists were people in France that wanted to restore the French monarchy. But this new government was put into place called the Directory. It was far more conservative than the Jacobin Republic had been. It was also ineffectual. It ruled France, created by the Council of Elders, and made up of 5 people to act as executive committee from 1795 to 1799. And what happens in 1799? Guess what? We bring in a man named Napoleon. Some say he was short, but he was about 5'7", so I don't know how short that is. Napoleon formed a new government, the Consulate, in which he held absolute power. In 1804, he crowned himself emperor. 2 years earlier, he signed a peace treaty with Russia, Great Britain, and Austria. At home, he made peace with the Catholic Church and created a functioning bureaucracy. The Napoleonic Code preserved many of the rights gained by the Revolution. War was soon renewed. By 1807, Napoleon had created a French empire. In parts of the empire, Napoleon sought to spread the revolution. However, his invasions contributed to the spread of nationalism. This, along with British sea power, would spell his defeat. After a disastrous invasion of Russia, other European nations attacked Napoleon's army and captured Paris. Napoleon was exiled, which means kicked out, from France, and the monarchy was restored. Napoleon returned to power briefly, only to face the final military defeat against a combined Prussian and British force at Waterloo, and to be exiled again. So who is this guy, Napoleon, that we hear so much about? There he is. He is from the island of Corsica, which you can see on the slide where it is located. It was invaded and taken over by France, which actually didn't please the people of Corsica. Apparently there were quite a few bees. The beeswax was farmed and taken by the Italians. You can see where Italy is located. And so the bee is actually a very famous symbol of Napoleon's. You can see it on his crest. The red area is actually covered in bees. Okay, Napoleon came to power with the coup d'etat in 1799 after many military victories around Europe and in Egypt. It is interesting that there are pictures drawn of his soldiers. They were actually basically kind of abandoned in Egypt. He was there for quite a long time. He actually said he was Muslim while he lived there. But they found the Rosetta Stone, which of course we discuss in history all the time because that is what is used to decipher all of the hieroglyphics. Now, he made a match with a woman that was quite popular in France, in Paris specifically, Josephine. And Josephine was considered extremely attractive. She was married to Napoleon in 1796. She was a socialite, think Real Housewives of Paris. She was married before and had 2 children by a man that was killed in the Reign of Terror. She was also imprisoned during that time. Her looks were fading, and she knew that she needed a man to support her, so she married Napoleon, not for love. She continued to carry on many affairs while he was away, conquering Europe before he was emperor. She could not provide him an heir, so he divorced her and married someone else. One of your questions will go over some of his beautiful love letters to her. He did love her. When he found out about her infidelities, however, kind of soured him, so he took up a mistress. And he did love her, but he still had this sense that he couldn't trust her anymore. Now, this is just a list of some of his failures and some of his accomplishments. I considered a failure that women did not have complete and equal rights to men when he was going through this whole revolutionary process. The invasion of Russia in June through December. The Russians kept backing up by 100 miles, burning everything in their wake, and they had that scorched earth policy. And so there was nothing to invade, and it became cold, and members of his army froze to death and starved. Hitler apparently didn't read his history books because he did the exact same thing. He was sent to Elba. It's off the coast of Tuscany and Italy. But then he snuck back into Paris, France, and kind of took control again. But then he lost at Waterloo to the Duke of Wellington, and after that they said, no, really, get out of France. And they sent him to the island of St. Helena, which is off the west coast of Africa. A little farther away. I think they thought he can't possibly sneak back from here. Now, his accomplishments: he made peace with the Catholic Church by declaring the majority religion Catholic, the majority religion of the people in France. He also made the Napoleonic Code of Laws, and he established a centralized administrative bureaucracy of government. There are so many things to watch and read about this time. I hope you take the time to look at the links that I have given you and watch the movies that are provided for you as well on my webpage.